holy books in their monasteries, and it was a form of worship. And they weren't even so much reading the books as they were just venerating God by doing this mundane task of copying book after book after book. In fact, the kind of wealth of a monastery was measured by how many books they had to copy. Kind of a typical monastery would have like 30 books, a really big one might have 100. And really, the books were just kept as breeding stock for more books. They didn't even spend that time reading them, but it was like, oh, we'll read today. I'm going to copy book number 47. And so that was a very different kind of impact of writing. It wasn't really an art form at that point either. It was really a form of worship. I don't think those monks would recognize it. And there were a couple of gating factors as far as writing is concerned. First of all, there was the process of recreating a book. I told the printing press it was a very laborious process. The book was a very expensive thing, only one thing to afford them. But also there was the fact of literacy. Most people couldn't read, because there weren't any books. It was a chicken and egg problem. And so once these two gates were unleashed, books became a form of mass media, that all sorts of things, were enabled by it. Comic books, as we know them today, really started as a form of propaganda. Some of the earliest things you might call comics were things, this is one that's actually, it was a critique of the Pope at the time, saying how the Pope would make people come in and kiss his feet, whereas Jesus would wash the feet of his followers. And so it was very much a religious propaganda piece, and also political propaganda. And again, these were targeted for illiterate audiences. These were ways that they could reach a mass audience that could not read. Even technology, very frequently, originates for purposes that we cannot see the trajectory of where it's going to go over time. When Alexander Graham Bell was trying to sell the phone, he was a big proponent of the phone, obviously, going around trying to hype it up. And so he made this preposterous claim. He said, I do not think I'm going to examine the possibilities of this invention when I tell you it is my firm belief that one day there will be a telephone in every major town in America. And this is the guy hyping the technology, right? And he had a hard time kind of even selling that claim. And this, he kind of saw this, and of course, this is something that didn't actually use. It was all world conflict, so wouldn't that be great? I don't think he foresaw a bunch of teenagers texting their friends to meet at the mall. We actually look at the number of phones out there right now. It's approaching the actual population on Earth. And it's amazing, once a technology gets that kind of mass adaptation, what ends up happening with it is totally unpredictable. The television, when it first came out, people thought there was going to be a renaissance in education. That was their firm belief that, oh, here's the ultimate educational tool. And of course, we get different kinds of It's a great one I found. I think kind of sums it up. The early digital computers, were invented by Alan Turing, and were invented to, break Nazi codes. And I'm sure he didn't foresee that one day that same technology would be used by a bunch of kids. Which was adopted far more rapidly than any other major technology we've come across. They didn't really foresee that it would be a place to buy rare Pokemon cards and download internet porn. Defense research projects. Now, each one of these things started to solve a very specific problem. But over time, as they became a very mass audience, it became, entertainment. And really there's this trajectory from problem solving to entertainment. And then, once they reach entertainment, then they start actually aspiring back upwards to artistic expression. And I think this has been true of almost every major form of media that we know of to this point. As we start aspiring to artistic expression, we start really engaging in the imagination of the viewer, the player, the consumer, whatever. And this is one of the hallmarks of what we consider art. Now, storytelling is one of the fundamentals of art forms in a lot of different media. Storytelling kind of draws in a number of kind of very specific elements. Most stories have very strong archetypes in them, characters that play out the story. Very strong environments and settings. As well as cool abilities and words that are not always available in the real world. And really all these things kind of combine together to bring us the stories, plot, the action that we kind of enjoy. If you kind of look at the archetypes, they typically are divided very strongly into kind of good and bad, very strongly delineated archetypes. Very frequently, they are drawn from previous archetypes. So you have reinterpretations of older archetypes. Sometimes it's Lucas was very much inspired with the old Samurai armor back in the Kurosawa movies. Some of the archetypes can be very specific. Most people don't realize that Gilligan's Island were based upon 7 deadly sins. So the professor represented pride, Marianne jealousy, because she was always jealous of Ginger, Gilligan sloth, of course, Ginger lust, Mr. Howell greed, Mrs. Howell gluttony, and gluttony in the form of conspicuous consumption, not necessarily being fat, and Skipper anger. So they got perfectly to the 7 deadly sins. And so what people don't realize is that really Gilligan's Island is the spiritual predecessor to Neil Gaiman's Now the settings parts. It's actually interesting to do a search of city planning literature. How often the term Blade Runner comes up now as a city planning term. People, they don't, the certain districts that are Blade Runner-ish, they start, reformulating their ideas about it. So it's become kind of a landmark that city planners actually use when they're thinking about world planning areas. And so these are like toy worlds that in your head, you're kind of playing with the archetypes and characters and verbs. The abilities, as I said before, they can be technology, whatever, but typically things can happen in these toy worlds. This really happened in ours. So James Bond relies on technology, and there's really relies upon magic. And these things, in our mind, they come alive. As stories, as characters, all these things, we can actually put in our head and run these as simulations in our imagination. Now, play is a little bit different in an interesting way from story. Play is almost like the natural thing that we're born into this world knowing how to do. If you look at like a little 2-year-old, they kind of naturally will start playing. And it's storytelling is the thing that really almost have to be taught. Games about exploring its possibility space. When you play a game, you can play a lot of different directions and explore all the different possibilities that are embedded in the game and the rules. Games, of course, have this ability to start over. You can go back to the story and explore a different path, which you're kind of mapping that possibility space. Now, I've noticed that there's a really interesting relationship between story and play. Stories, the best stories, I really want to be able to deconstruct in my head. I want to be able to, in my imagination, wonder, what would happen if I put the Imperial battle cruiser versus the Cylon Death Star versus the Spore machine. I have a huge internet debate about this. That's so surprising. What would happen if we sent James Bond after it was all good? Interestingly, they form play experiences. The best stories turn into deconstructed play experiences. Now, play on the other hand, I think is very generative. When I think of the best games are trending toward more and more limited experiences, things like Grand Theft Auto or The Sims, but basically things where the player is taking these elements and combining them together to recreate interesting stories. When we worked on Spore, we actually thought about, what were some of our favorite science fiction elements, and what did they represent, kind of in terms of the underlying action that's going on. And from that, we really started deconstructing, what are the verbs that are implicit in these storylines? We can now move back to players as verbs. And so, what if you were able to do abduct things in the game? Or, fly through hyperspace really fast, or have weapons, really powerful. What if you terraform worlds, where you could magically create giant monsters, or, uplift intelligence, create crop circles, be invisible. All these things became the verbs in the game that, recombining them, you can basically create your own storylines, your own space operas. So, inherently, I think good play leads to really interesting stories, player stories, that you're playing out the game. And interesting stories are inherently deconstructible in interesting play experiences. These are both forms of model building, really in our head. We're using our imagination to build more accurate models of the real world. So all these properties and sciences are using to build patterns. We're getting very good at solving patterns, discovering patterns, using those patterns to then go back and model the real world. We're learning modeling, in essence, from these things, both from play and from story. In something like Spore, we were actually kind of starting with this deconstruction process. How do we deconstruct this whole universe we want to kind of show in Spore? And so we started looking at different ways that evolution was presented in alternate ways. We started looking at kind of futuristic or scientific ways of postulating life on other planets. Some of it, was very aesthetic and very artistic. Others, more playful, more toy-like. Each one of these things becomes, what are different representations we see in the world around us, and how can we make use of that? One of the things we did was we spent a lot of time studying these old pulp science fiction covers back in the 30s and 40s, which were really interesting. And if you look at a lot of these, you start seeing certain numbers of elements that are kind of repeated on them. And we actually had one of our artists go back and try to deconstruct, the most common elements that we saw in these things. And we found, primarily business covers are made out of interesting alien creatures, cool vehicles, strange futuristic buildings, and funny planets, and occasionally the word Spore. My chief animator, Bob King, actually made these Spore covers, trying to kind of replicate what would it be like if you took the Spore universe back into that pulp universe. Now, the other side of this is I've always been one to try to bring in